Oh, goody. Okay. So we're talking about discernment, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, I mentioned in the talk, question and answer thing, that one of the key things about a parent is example, okay? And in my own family, it was recognized when you reached a certain age, you could go to church or not on your own. But it was greatly affected by if you had younger brothers or sisters. So like, for instance, I could stop going when my sister reached the age, but I had to provide the example until she reached that sort of thing. But anyway, the first thing to know about this is you cannot come to know God without freedom, okay? And the number of people like who in the Catholic Church have been very bound as they go forward and then walk away and come back as powerful converts 2 years later is absolutely remarkable. That they have had an impression of the church because of the way authorities dealt with them, that once they get away, it's a whole different thing. And this idea of you cannot be forced to believe and you cannot be forced to love, okay? Always consider belief in terms of love. You cannot force this. It's a sort of thing you can cultivate, you can do all kinds of things, but you cannot force it. And I'd just like to tell you a couple of stories. Number one is, I was associate pastor in Salinas for, I guess it was 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, I was made pastor at Mission San Luis Obispo. So in the parish in Salinas, in order to be confirmed, the student had to make the decision on their own to be confirmed. Now, as we found out later, a lot of it was encouraged by the fact of maybe getting a car or something. But anyway, from our side, they had to make the decision. So there was one young man in a family, and the family was very staunchly Catholic and everything, and he decided not to get confirmed. It was very discouraging to his family and everything, who were really kind of an example in the parish. And so all that went on. Then I was made pastor in San Luis Obispo. And like as most places, when there's a change of clergy, the first time you notice it is when there's someone different in the church, someone different at the altar. So I'm distributing communion, and this young man comes up to communion. I hold up the host. I can't tell whether he or I is more surprised. So I hold up the host and I say, "Don't worry, I won't tell your mother." And I gave him communion. And he went on to be confirmed at the Cal Poly and everything. But the faith he would not practice in his home. He was practicing on his own when he went to college. And again, now it was in freedom. This was his choice. If he wasn't going, they would never have known. And thanks to me, when he started going, they still didn't know, okay? That he eventually shared it with them. And the other one has to do with a man in the parish. He was from Scotland. He decided to marry a Catholic girl. Scotland, the religion there is Presbyterian, and Presbyterian is the faith, basically, it was founded by John Calvin, but his principal follower was John Knox from Scotland, who founded. It is the most anti-Catholic of all of the Protestant faiths. It doesn't come across that way in the United States, because we're used to all different kinds of Protestants. But in Scotland, I want you to know it's militant. And so when this man decided to marry a Catholic girl, he had to leave Scotland. He lost his job, references and everything. So he left his job and he came to the United States, and he actually, over a period of time, became a Catholic. He had 4 sons, And all of his sons went off to these huge mega churches, and it was devastating to him because of what he gave up in order to be a Catholic. And so, he would always pray for the return of his children to the faith. And you would hear that anytime we'd have petitions allowed and this sort of thing. And then finally, he died, and we had his funeral. And of course, the kids had to show up for the funeral, so they're there at the funeral. And 2 Sundays later, the eldest son came back to church. And he came on and off for a couple months, and then he started coming every Sunday and became integrated into the church. Now, I left the parish not too long after that, but the last Sunday I was in the parish before I left, the next oldest son had come back. And in time, all 4 of them returned. And they returned largely because of the example of their father. He couldn't force them to be Catholics. He tried his damnedest. He could not force them to be Catholics. But his example forced them to be Catholics once they got away. And I think that, that ultimately, no matter what kind of constraints or force you put on your children, they will walk away from that, those strict constraints. And it's what they will be after they walk away from the constraints. Same thing with you, with your parents, A lot of us, our parents made us go to church, and as went on, we continued going to church. A lot of us dropped away while we were in college. A lot of us dropped away at one time or another, came back. There's all kinds of examples of this. But what you want to do is your children have got to have the example of someone who enjoys their faith, okay? Like if all you are is being miserable in the faith, I can be miserable someplace else, okay? But you want to be able to demonstrate you enjoy the faith and being involved in it. Also in this relationship with God and what he's calling us to do, you have to know that in God's plan, there are no, I will say, supporting roles. They're nothing but stars from God's point of view. That every life we believe in the Catholic Church fulfills a role that cannot be fulfilled by anybody else. And there may be a role that does not appear to be too important to you, but it doesn't matter. And it may be in your life you never figure out your role. That doesn't matter either. In fact, I'll give you a wonderful example of John the Baptizer. When John the Baptizer, they came up to him and said, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "No." He was right. He wasn't the Messiah. "Are you the prophet?" No, he was wrong. He was the final prophet. When they say the prophet rather than a prophet, the prophet is the prophet who immediately precedes the Messiah. He was the prophet. But he didn't know it. Why? Wasn't important, he knew it. You know what was important? He knew his job. So they asked him, "Well, what are you doing?" His job. "I'm out in the desert crying out repentance so that people will turn to the Lord." Okay? Well, honey, that's what the prophet does for a living. Okay? You are the prophet. Don't ever be the person who judges your role in the church. There are many people who have unbelievably powerful roles in the church who never know it their entire life. The Bible is littered with them. If you read the text, people have thought they were unimportant or significant. I'll give you just one example. The book of Job. I don't know if you know this, but the whole concept of everlasting life begins in the book of Job. And because in Judaism, they believed in no everlasting life. Most Jews today don't believe in everlasting life. But this idea of everlasting life to them, sort of seemed impossible. But when you study Judaism, you discover they have a very interesting approach to God. The approach that I have, and I presume most of you have, when I reach the throne of God, I want and expect mercy. That's what I'm about when I get there. Jews know. Do you know what Jews want from God? Justice. I pray to God I never see justice. But anyway, what the Jews have always wanted justice. And do you know why? They've always been a persecuted people. So they say, I just want an even playing ground. I don't expect anything special, you know? So their whole thing is that God has to be just. And in their justice idea, if you're a good person, your life will be rewarded by being wealthy, good-looking, everything like that. And if you're a bad person, your life turns to manure, pure and simple, okay? But the book of Job is very interesting because the book of Job points out a man whose life has literally turned to manure. And it also points out a man who's leading an extremely good life. Well, if this guy is leading a good life and it's turning into a mess, there has to be everlasting life or God is not just. There is no justice in this world. I didn't want to surprise you, but there is no justice in this world. And if God is just, there has to be justice somewhere. So the idea came up, maybe there is another life. Now that other life will rise in importance in one group called the Pharisees. And Jesus is a Pharisee. He's part of that group. And so this whole idea of everlasting life becomes one of the basic themes in his teaching of presenting the faith to us. And I think it's important to remember that it all began with a man who believed his life was lost. It was a disaster. The kids were dead. And sometimes I remember a rabbi was telling me that, well, you know, Job was rewarded in his lifetime. If you remember at the end of the book, he gets more children and this sort of thing. And I said to the rabbi, I said, if you have ever lost a child, you would never think that any number of new children could replace it. That would never even occur to you. And the fact is, 1 million children would not have replaced one child who died of his. So ultimately, it guaranteed everlasting life. And it's due to the difficulties and the problems he had in his life. That changed the entire teaching. And our whole lives in the faith are based on the fact we live forever. You hear it over and over again in our prayers and all the times. This idea that we will really live forever. And I'd like, again, to underline this thing about no minor roles in the church. I mentioned one of my favorite saints is Charles de Foucauld. And I don't know if I told you about his life, but Charles led a very strange life, and his family was an important family in France. And so they decided he was a total embarrassment to the family with his escapades. So they forced him into the Foreign Legion to get him out of France. And believe it or not, his life was so screwed up, the Foreign Legion got rid of him. And so he had to leave the Foreign Legion, at which point he became very concerned about his life. While he was in the Foreign Legion, he traveled all over Morocco and did maps. And the maps that were used in Morocco were his maps up until they began photographing from satellites, okay? But up till that point, they were all Charles de Foucault's maps. But he really loved that part of the world. So he moved to Palestine, where he would have that kind of a Muslim environment and everything. And so he moved there. But there he went through a conversion process and ultimately became a priest. And once he became a priest, his passion was to convert the Muslim tribes of Morocco. So he went to Morocco, he joined one of the tribes called Tuareg. And he joined this tribe, and he traveled with them for several years. They're a nomadic tribe. He traveled with them and hoped to convert them. He never converted any of them. He wanted to start a religious order that would then come over and work with the Muslims, and he never got anyone to come to him to start his order or anything, but he had written a rule. And when he died, the rule he wrote has become the rule of every new order founded since his death. And the reason is he wrote a rule for a Catholic community in a non-religious society, okay? And so that's what he wanted to do, to set it up. Well, the fact of the matter is there are no religious societies in the world today. There's no country you can actually say is a religious country. There are a lot of religious people in countries, but there's no country that on its own is religious. So this rule has totally formed the church since that time. And he thought his life was a failure. He was murdered by the people in the tribe, never made a convert, never had a follower. And ultimately, he remade the church for the next about 50 years. And it's something to really understand. Again, there are no minor roles in the church. You don't know what your role is, but there are no minor roles in the church. Another thing in this choosing goods, human beings are naturally inclined to the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. We really want to believe. And I don't mean just in God. We want to believe that when I get a car from General Motors, they're not trying to kill me. I want to believe that when I'm paying my taxes, it's honest. We love to believe. And that's one of the hard things about being a human being, is this belief is always being changed in one way or another. But you know, it never has with God. That's why faith really flourishes in the presence of God. St. Augustine says at Last Judgment, before God judges us, God the Father will stand up, he'll look at everyone who ever lived, all gathered, and he'll look at them and say, can anyone show me any promise I have ever made that I haven't kept? St. Augustine says there'll be dead silence. Then we begin our judgment, okay? But the judgment of God is, have you ever said anything that you have not done? The answer is no. The faith in God is solid. So that's a natural thing. And hope. You know, sometimes in our lives, the only thing we've had is hope. We see things fall around and we hope, tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow will be better. And I'm not talking just religious hope. I'm talking hope about life, hope about family, hope about everything. And the same thing with love. We really want to be loved. We want to love people. We want the relationship of love to grow with a person. We don't want to see it lost. But I want you to understand the three things, faith, hope, and charity, are natural to a human being. They are natural and comfortable to a human being. Faith in the world, people have no religion. Hope for their future, and the affection they have with people around them. Those are the major things in any person's life, and they are the theological virtues. And to understand this is a part of the very thing of what it is to be a human being, not just religion. It would be the thing if there were no religions at all. It's part of what it is to be human. Another thing is, in this idea of choosing between goods, the idea of making a mistake. Remember, you're making a mistake between two goods. It isn't like making a mistake that's fatal. Okay, we aren't making a mistake of accidentally committing a murder or something. That isn't what we're talking. We're talking choice of goods. Do you know the lives of saints? There are all kinds of examples of that. I'll give you the example of Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi had this great call from God in his dream. And God called him, he says, Francis, I want you to rebuild my church. The church was in a terrible thing at the time. And so God called Francis to rebuild the church. What did Francis do? Francis immediately went to the neighboring valley where there was an old broken down church and rebuilt it. And so God sat there waiting till he got all finished. Then when he got back, God repeated the dream. Francis, I want you to rebuild my church. Capital C. Okay? So anyway, then Francis went on in his life to do what he did to found the order and basically reformed the church in Europe at the time, changed the church entirely. But he had a misunderstanding that didn't bother God. He went on. I think the way God deals with us with regards to this, this business of mistakes is very much like Siri. She just recalculates and pushes you on, you know? And so I think God simply does that. That recalculation is a very simple thing, and we go on. But you'll find that in many lives of the saints. They misunderstood the call of God. Another thing that I think is really to be seen in decisions, you want to be very careful of any decision that points towards a division in your family, division in the country, division in the way people think. We don't want to be people who divide. We want to be people who somehow unite. Because I think we believe that we get the best answer from many people, okay? That no one has the right answer purely. We all hold the elements to the answer. And in going back and forth, I think one of the things that could have happened with Father and I up here is we could have talked forever, because anytime one of us said something, it triggered something in the other guy's mind. That's just the way it goes. But we as a community work together, and we can do powerful things. And I'll give you an example in my mind. I have a good background in history. And if you remember, when Martin Luther started out, his big concern was indulgences, because they were selling indulgences. And then he wanted the scriptures in the vernacular, in his case, German. And then he wanted people to be able to receive from the cup as well as the host. And he wanted I forget what the other one was now. But anyway, he had these things. He wanted the service in the vernacular. So he wanted these things. They were very, very important. And he broke from the church. And as a result of his break from the church, the most horrible war that ever went through Europe went on. It's called the 30 Years' War. I think a little over a quarter of the entire population of Europe died in the 30 Years' War. And one side would win, the Catholics, and if we won, we killed as many Protestants as we could. Protestants won, they returned the favor, okay? So this went on back and forth. Now that's all behind us. And now what do we have? We have communion under two species. We have the liturgy of the vernacular. You never hear indulgences talked about. Everything Luther wanted, we now have. And we could have gotten it without the 30-year war. If he had refused to leave and we'd refused to throw him out. There'd have been a lot of fighting and infighting and everything. But in the end, we'd have what we have now, except we'd all be one church. There'd be a lot more people who lived through the 30-year war. It's remarkable when we watch in history. Division does not solve things. And in our lives, when we feel called to a decision that brings division, watch that very carefully. That usually is wrong. A decision that brings this kind of division is usually wrong. Another one is isolation. To remove ourselves from organizations, from a church, from a marriage, from all removing ourselves is not usually the solution. Can be, but very rarely is that the solution. We want to try and maintain community. And I don't know if you know, but in the early part of the church, one of the things that happened, there were so many people who were interested in the history of the martyrs. Remember, immediately coming out of the thing when the church got her freedom, everyone who was canonized at that time was a martyr. So it was very easy to get the impression in your mind, you know, if I'm going to be a saint, I got to be a martyr. And that was a very common way of thinking. And they realized, you know, you don't become a saint by killing yourself. So what they decided to do was to take a life where they go off all on their own and live a life of extreme penance in great privacy. And we call that the age of the hermits. And that there are hermits all over. A lot of them are canonized. A lot of the hermits are canonized. But what the church kind of realized was that people who live alone gradually go crazy. You know? They become very focused in certain... We all have eccentricities. And usually in a group of people, we try and cover them or they break off, this sort of thing. But when you're alone, they will flower. They just grow like topsy. So the church actually passed a law against it. You can't be a hermit now in the Catholic Church, certainly not as a priest or religious. The closest thing we have to that is the Camaldolese in this diocese. And where do the Camaldolese? They have individual hermitages, and they raise a little garden individually. They have to come together for prayers so many times a day, and they have certain times where they interact with one another as groups, all by regulation. Now that, you can be that much of a hermit and survive. But they recognized immediately that this sort of thing was destroying people. And oftentimes, people, when they're making choices, you know, like I saw this when I was, I think I told you that because of the dyslexia, if I had an option in a course, I always took something had to do with art. That's pictures, no words. So I would go into it. But in the study of art, it's really interesting that you have all these famous artists, if you'd study their lives and history, who get something they're very good at and then, you know, go into it. But one of the key things is if they stay in contact with other artists, or if they have to support themselves by selling their pictures, that's another thing that will... It causes them to alter and become better artists in their response to this thing and the way it works. And it is all because of this interaction of staying together and being a part of one another and things. There are four things actually, that they say are really dangerous and bad decisions. First of all is physically hungry. If you're physically hungry, you don't usually make good decisions, particularly in front of your icebox, okay? But you notice in your own life, hunger is a physical weakness, and people do not make good decisions. Be very careful about making a significant decision while you're hungry, okay? So go out to dinner and then make the decision. Another one is angry. I think every one of us at one time or another in our lives have had to apologize for what we said or did when we were angry. That's very common experience of people. We do not make proper decisions when we are angry. And you know, that's so much part of being a human being that it's good for us to be able to get good at doing that when it happens. You know, to say something that say, I'm sorry, I'm angry, and you go on. If you don't do it right away, do it later. But understand, particularly in life decisions, you know, someone will get really mad at a boss and simply go on to another business or something, maybe something they would have done very well in. Someone gets really angry with a pastor and leaves the church. You know, I think going to another parish, I think people should find where they're comfortable. but not to abandon the church with regards to some person. And so another one of these is loneliness. And I would tie this to being isolated. When we're really lonely, loneliness is a real plague on people. And I think I told you that I'm living in a sort of a retirement place, one of these 3 tiers. There's living, independent living, assisted living, and they also have an Alzheimer's unit. But the interesting thing is watching how loneliness affects the people there. I'm in a place where you can have dogs and stuff like that if you want, but a person needs to find some resolution to loneliness, or you won't, go. I remember one time I was giving a retreat to a group of men in Canada, and I was giving this talk that I would describe as mesmerizing on loneliness. And so I was giving this talk, and I remember when I was leaving, a man came up to me, a middle-aged man, and he said, "You do not know the meaning of loneliness till you've gone to bed with a woman who is not talking to you." It really struck me, there's more to getting over loneliness than having another person, or a dog, for God's sake. But this idea of, you and I want to make sure that I never become, I think we're all eccentric to one extent or another. I never want to be so eccentric I become lonely, that it removes me from all kinds of people. Because in loneliness, nobody makes a good decision. You do not make good decisions in loneliness. Okay? And the last one they mention is when you're tired. When I was a youngster, one of the things they used to constantly say when you're thinking about planning things, they would say, sleep on it. I found out in psychology that is a good idea. It is a good idea not to make decisions when you're very tired. These 4 things are called by a lot of people who deal in this kind of literature, they're called the doors of Satan. The doors of Satan are hunger, anger, loneliness, and tiredness. So they call them that. I want you to know, I do not believe that Satan has as much influence in our lives as people seem to talk about or think. As I told you, I had a great devotion to Augustine. And when they talked to Augustine about this, Augustine said, Satan may well be working on other people, but I don't think he bothers with me because I have enough temptations in my own self to go to hell on my own. And so I said, he doesn't need to add anything to this mix. He just stands and watches. And I sort of feel that when I see these as weaknesses, I don't see them as satanic. That's just kind of not the way to think. Another one is we tend to lie to ourselves oftentimes in making decisions. Where I've noticed this most in counseling is with alcoholics. An alcoholic who every time he sits down with this group of friends, this bar, knows he's going to go home drunk, but knows it won't happen next time. And they go through their whole life like this. And you can do this with all kinds of sins, that in mine when I was young was the idea that I had a lot of things I was really interested in. So I oftentimes put off the things I had to do in the sure knowledge I would do them the night before. I was never right. Never right. Never worked that way. Okay? So this idea about being very careful about lying to ourselves, and I mentioned yesterday that that's the key to Genesis, that when the demon came to, in the form of the snake, came to Eve, the demon said, I understand God said you can't eat from the tree or even touch it. God never said you can't touch the tree. But Eve bought that. And then, having bought that lie, she was open to the next lie, where Satan says, you know, he doesn't want you to eat from it because it will give you the knowledge of good and evil. And then you'll have the knowledge that God has, complete knowledge. And she fell for that. And if you study in theology, they tell you that God does not have the knowledge of good and evil. God only has the knowledge of good. And where the contrary is there, that's evil. But his knowledge is the knowledge of good. And if I only had the knowledge of good, when I would look at a rock, I might think of making it, cutting and polishing it. I might think of collecting it, making a rock garden. But it would never occur to me to throw it at someone. That's the knowledge of evil. And not having the knowledge of evil, there's no evil in the world at all. And what happened to Adam and Eve, having eaten, they immediately noticed something evil about being naked. But they never did beforehand. It's like if you have a bunch of young children, they won't notice anything about being naked, being wrong, or anything. It's a non-thing. And that's because they haven't entered into the age we are. But as you discovered it as wrong, it becomes this knowledge of good and evil. Then you see evil there. And so this idea of not lying to one another, and personally, not lying to yourself, that's the main thing. And another one was the one that we discussed up here, is the concept of looking for peace. This is one of the major things in Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola says that having decided to make a decision, he said, sit some time with it and see if it causes you peace or anxiety. Does the thought of this decision just bring up a lot of problems and all that sort of thing? And Father mentioned that, you know, the peace he felt when he came back from the retreat about the decision he had to make. The peace was before the decision. But making the decision, he felt peace in that decision. And this concept of peace, where God reigns, peace always reigns, okay? And you can be in the most difficult of situations, like if you, again, read the lives of martyrs and things. And in the situations they're in, they oftentimes, in the reading of them, are really horrific. But oftentimes you can see in the reading itself that the person is in a life of peace. And I mentioned that like earlier with regards to Mother Teresa. I would never want to live that life at all, but God knows it made her happy. And same thing with Francis of Assisi. So that we want to be able to make a decision that we have a sense of peace over, and that the decision will build our own peace. That goes on to people around us. I think one of the major experiences I had when I was in Kauai, I lived with a priest who, I think there's a big influence when a person becomes a priest with the person who is their first pastor. That person has a lot of influence on you. Well, this guy was my first pastor. I'd been a priest about 4 years, but teaching and stuff. But this was the first time I worked in a parish. And I have never dealt with such a peaceful man in my entire life. I should mention one other thing. He was on the island of Kauai. He served in about 3 parishes over there. And when he died, he had the second largest funeral in the history of the state. And the only one who had the largest was Father Damien in Molokai. But he had the second largest funeral. People came from all the islands. I didn't know he was that well known. But just to give you one example, when I went to the parish as an associate, I came out of Berkeley. And so I had a very set attitude with regards to the war and all these kinds of things. And so I arrived at the parish, and I explained to the pastor, the Sunday after I arrived was to be the 4th of July. So I explained to the pastor I would never say Mass in a church if there was a flag in the church, and that I didn't want anyone on the altar wearing a uniform. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Hawaii for the 4th of July, but remember, they are the only state that actually experienced the war. So when you go there on the 4th of July, there will not be a single person on the altar not wearing a uniform, with the exception of the priest. Like even the altar boys will be wearing at least Boy Scout uniform. Everyone will be in uniform. And normally when I would do something like this in the religious order, they'd get upset with me, we'd have an argument and all this sort of thing, and then I'd sulk and do what I was supposed to do anyway. This guy had nothing like that at all. He says, I will phone the people who decorate the church and ask them to remove the flags before your Mass. I will call the people who will be serving on the altar, so no one will be wearing a uniform when they come on the altar. And I've scheduled a meeting for you with all those people immediately after the Mass. Okay? And when I went to the meeting, and people were very gentle and very good at the meeting, they explained Pearl Harbor to me. They explained what they went through. They explained all, and this priest operated in such a peaceful way. And I would say he didn't change my political opinion, but what he did change was the way I dealt with it. He made me a person you could deal with and go. He did that consistently. And it was because he refused to allow a confrontation. It was always in peace. It doesn't matter what the issue was, doesn't matter what the problem was, we can solve it. And if we're going to solve it in a way that offends people or something, then you will explain it to them afterwards. And it was just a wonderful experience. But he was a man who acted in peace. As such, he could do practically anything. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.
Questions? Questions?
Questions? Oh, I thought we did that.
Hey.
Oh, I have one. So I've been going back and forth and kind of trying to process my understanding of carrying your cross. And like we were taught to carry your cross, which I interpret that to mean suffering. We're guaranteeing suffering in this world, versus now what you're speaking about is that actually let's look at joy and let's look at peace.
Yeah.
So sometimes in life we have to go through that suffering to get some goodness.
Exactly.
So how do you decipher from going a route that's peaceful versus a route that's suffering? Like, how do you discern those two?
What you do in the concept of suffering is that you don't induce suffering in your life. Like, for instance, they used to wear hair shirts and beat themselves. You don't do that. But what you do is any good you pursue is going to have a cost. Anything you do has a cost. That is your cross. You don't need to construct a cross. Like, for instance, you're married? Are you married?
No.
No?
I'm engaged.
Well, good luck. Anyway, when a person's married, you have the marriage and the children, this sort of thing. But it is an ongoing difficulty, because you both have different ideas about how things should be done, and you constantly go through that. But that's the cross you bear in order to have a family. Okay? Having a family is a good, but it entails difficulties. You want to be a priest, it takes this much education, these sorts of things. There are these difficulties. But you want to be passionate about what you're about. And if you're passionate about what you're about, the difficulties do not appear to be as big as they really are. But we don't believe, and I think you'd say today, we do not believe in pursuing, pain for its own good, okay? That we don't do that. There are all kinds of problems connected with anything decent we do, and that's your cross. You don't need to construct one, okay?
Father, you alluded to separation and how we can try to avoid separation as much as we can. Can you speak on, and I'm going to ruffle some feathers, can you speak on the Latin Mass and maybe its prohibition or how the Pope maybe has not addressed doing away with the Latin Mass and how maybe that's caused some separation in the church?
Did you hear that?
The Latin Mass.
See, to me, coming through the system, I don't understand it. Go ahead, you heard him.
I know Francis, or if you could just speak on the separation. Sorry, take that down.
Go ahead, say it.
Can you speak on the separation that's happened between the doing away with the Latin Mass? And the
Okay, sure. There's a great conflict in the church with regards to the retention of the Latin Mass. And I would say, I think for priests my age, it's a huge curiosity because the people most in favor of it have never seen it. That wasn't a part of their background. And so it's a difficult thing to understand. I think what most of us would like, I don't know what the church is doing on, is that you would have the optional thing. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when I was pastor of Mission San Luis Obispo, when I came in, they didn't have communion under two species or any of the changes made. So I began to make the changes. And I noticed there was a group that were really concerned about the changes. So I asked, does everyone know what an epiarch is? An epiarch. An epiarch is the equivalent of a bishop in the Catholic, Greek Catholics, Byzantine Catholics, those. So I phoned him, he was in Van Nuys. I said, if you send up a priest, I'll give him land and we will build a Byzantine Catholic church. And I did that specifically so that people who were really into that stuff and didn't want to see the changes, most of them went over to the Byzantine, still a Catholic church, but very elaborate ceremonies, everything, they went with it. But there has to be ways to resolve that stuff, and that's the way I went about resolving it. But I'll tell you the thing that bothers me most about it is the number of young people who receive communion on the tongue who have never had a class in it. And you end up licked or bit by half of them, Like when I was a kid, before we received communion on the tongue, we were trained. And that way the nuns got bit, but we priests were fine, So, but anyway, that's the way it was done. People like my age who decide to receive communion on the tongue, it's usually no problem because they were trained with it. We learned it. But I notice a lot of people picking up the things of the older church who don't understand what they were, how they were. And so they don't quite know how to pull it off, And it's another thing. You're open enough here so you could see it wouldn't be a problem. But in a church with people coming up for communion standing, when someone kneels down, I've on 4 occasions seen someone fall and once someone go to a hospital because you just didn't see someone kneeling on the floor in front of them because there are people standing up. I think, I certainly am in favor of the changes, but there has to be some way to accommodate people so that they don't, we're in our church, that's the thing of the idea of being Catholic, that they're Greek Catholics, Russian Catholics. So the Catholic Church is much wider than a Latin Catholic Church. And so maybe people need to find expression in other branches of the church too. You can do that, still stay Catholic. Okay? But I'm uncomfortable with forbidding something. I just don't like that sort of stuff.
Anyone else?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's break in.